When did a prank on a teacher go too far? Mrs. Osborne immediately locked the classroom door and screamed, "Which one of you thought it was funny to prank call my mother last night?" A couple of boys in the back snickered nervously, but nobody raised their hand. Aiden and Alex were always pulling stupid pranks, so everyone assumed it was them, but they shook their heads when people looked their way. Whoever did it scared her so badly that she had a heart attack. "My mother died last night because one of you thought it would be hilarious to call and threaten her." The room went completely silent. Even the kids who never paid attention were staring at Mrs. Osborne in shock. Someone's backpack fell off their desk, and the thud made everyone jump. "Nobody is leaving this room until I find out who did it. The police are waiting outside to arrest whoever is responsible." Danica raised her hand tentatively and asked if we could call our parents. Mrs. Osborne shook her head and said not until someone confessed. She pulled her chair in front of the door and sat down with her arms crossed. Her phone kept buzzing, but she ignored it. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Students started whispering to each other, trying to figure out who could have done it. Everyone had Mrs. Osborne's number from the class contact sheet she'd handed out at the beginning of the year. Any of us could have found her mom's information online. Kenny suggested it might have been someone from another period, but Mrs. Osborne said the caller mentioned specific things from our class, details only someone in the first period would know. She'd narrowed it down to us 30 students and wouldn't stop until she had a name. The accusations started flying. People pointed fingers at the usual suspects like Aiden and Alex. Then someone mentioned that Alexis had been mad about her grade on the last essay. Ian said he'd overheard Lawrence joking about prank calling teachers. Everyone was turning on each other, trying to deflect suspicion. Mrs. Osborne just sat there watching us with those red-rimmed eyes. Every few minutes she'd remind us that her mother was dead because of someone in this room. The weight of it pressed down on all of us. Some girls were crying. A few guys looked ready to bolt for the windows. I noticed Philip in the corner wiping his face with his sleeve. He was the quiet kid who sat alone and never caused trouble. While everyone else was arguing and defending themselves, he was silently crying. Something about his reaction seemed different from the general panic in the room. The room was getting hot with all of us trapped inside. Someone banged on the door from the outside, but Mrs. Osborne didn't move. We could hear muffled voices that sounded like administrators trying to get in. She'd barricaded us in here and wasn't budging until she got her answer. An hour passed, then 2. We'd missed second period completely, and third was starting. Parents were probably being called. The police were supposedly waiting. Everything was spiraling out of control because of one stupid prank call that had gone horribly wrong. Riley started having a panic attack and begged to go to the nurse. Mrs. Osborne wouldn't let her leave. Marco tried to reason with her, explaining this was kidnapping or false imprisonment. She laughed bitterly and said the police could arrest her after they arrested her mother's killer. That's when I noticed Philip had moved to the back of the room. He was sitting on the floor behind the last row of desks with his knees pulled to his chest. His whole body was shaking. While everyone else was scared of getting in trouble, he looked absolutely terrified. I made my way over to him, stepping around backpacks and angry classmates. When I sat down next to him, he flinched like I might hit him. Up close, I could see his face was blotchy from crying, and his breathing was ragged. "Philip, are you okay?" He shook his head, and fresh tears started falling. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them in for hours. "It was me. I was dared to do it." Aiden said I was too much of a pussy to prank call a teacher. He gave me $20 and said I had to make it scary or it didn't count. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted them to think I was cool for once. "Please don't let me go to jail. I can't go to jail. I'm only 15. Mrs. Osborne went white. She stood up and started slowly marching over to Philip. Her footsteps echoed across the silent classroom as she crossed the room in 5 quick strides. Philip tried to scramble backwards but hit the wall behind him. She grabbed his shoulders with both hands and her fingers dug into his shirt. Her whole body was shaking as she stared down at him. Everyone in the class froze completely. Nobody moved or even breathed. Philip's eyes were huge and wet with tears as he looked up at her face. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The veins in her neck stood out, and her face had gone from white to red. I pushed myself up from the floor and took 3 steps toward them. My hand reached out and touched her arm. Her sleeve was damp with sweat, and I could feel her muscles tight under the fabric. She turned her head to look at me, and her eyes weren't the eyes of a teacher anymore. They were just sad and broken and lost. For just a second, she looked like any other daughter who had lost her mom. Her grip on Philip loosened slightly. The door exploded open with a loud crack. 3 administrators rushed in with 2 security guards right behind them. They took in the scene in about half a second. Mrs. Osborne standing over Philip with her hands on him, and me touching her arm trying to pull her back. The security guards moved fast. One grabbed Mrs. Osborne's wrists and pulled them off Philip's shoulders, while the other stepped between them. She started screaming as they pulled her away. The same words over and over. She kept saying he killed her and pointing at Philip, who had curled into a ball on the floor. The security guards guided her toward the door with one on each side holding her arms. She twisted and fought against them the whole way. Her voice got louder as they got her into the hallway. We could still hear her shouting about her mother and demanding justice even after the door closed behind them. The administrators stayed in the room with us. One of them told us all to sit down and not move. More adults flooded in through the door. Some were teachers from other classrooms and others looked like office staff. They spread out around the room watching us. Gary Barnett walked in about 2 minutes later. He stood at the front of the classroom and looked at all of us. His face was serious but calm. He told us we would each be interviewed about what happened. He said to stay in our seats until called. Philip was still in the corner with his head buried in his hands. His shoulders moved up and down as he cried. A woman with curly hair walked in next. She went straight to Riley, who was still breathing funny and making little gasping sounds. The woman put her hand on Riley's back and spoke quietly to her. After a minute, she helped Riley stand up and walked her toward the door. They left together, heading for the nurse's office. The rest of us sat in complete silence. Nobody wanted to look at each other. The clock on the wall showed we had been trapped in here for over 2 hours. My legs were stiff from sitting on the floor. An administrator came to the door and called out the first name. Kenny got up and followed them into the hallway. 5 minutes later, they called Danica, then Ian. One by one, they took us out for our statements. Some kids came back to the room after, and others didn't. When they called my name, I stood up on shaky legs. The hallway was full of people. Parents were there now, demanding to know what happened. Police officers stood near the main office. The administrator led me past all of them to a small room. Inside was the woman with curly hair who had helped Riley. She smiled at me and said her name was Alina LeBlanc. She asked me to sit down and tell her what I saw. I started to explain about Mrs. Osborne locking us in, but then stopped. I told her I needed to talk to someone privately first. She looked confused, but nodded. She said we could talk in her office where it was more comfortable. We walked down another hallway to a door with her name on it. Inside were 2 chairs and a small couch. Pictures of mountains covered the walls. She sat in one chair and I took the other. I told her everything Philip had said to me, about the dare from Iden, about the $20, about wanting to be cool, about how scared he was of going to jail. She listened without interrupting and wrote notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, she put down her pen. She explained that the police needed to know this right away. She picked up her phone and called someone. A minute later, Gary Barnett walked into the office. Alina told him to sit down, and then asked me to repeat what Philip had told me. I went through it all again. The dare and the money and everything. His face went from confused to shocked to pale. He rubbed his forehead with one hand. He stood up quickly and told someone outside the door to bring Philip to his office immediately. Then he looked at me and said I would need to talk to the police detective who was on the way. I sat in a plastic chair outside Gary's office for what felt like forever, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. I typed a message to my mom as fast as I could. The text just said there was an emergency at the school and Mrs. Osborne locked us in the classroom and the police were coming. My phone buzzed almost instantly with her reply saying she was leaving work right now and not to say anything to anyone without her there. I put my phone away and watched the chaos building in the hallway. More parents kept showing up, their faces all confused and angry as they demanded to know why their kids had been locked in a classroom. The secretary kept telling them to please wait and that Gary would explain everything soon. About an hour later, a woman in a dark suit walked through the main doors carrying a briefcase. She had short gray hair and looked really serious as she walked straight to the principal's office. Gary came out and shook her hand, and I heard him call her Detective McLean. They went into a conference room down the hall, and I could see through the window as she set up a laptop and pulled out a yellow notepad. Gary came back out and told me the detective was ready to talk to me, but we should wait for my mom. My hands were still shaking, and I kept thinking about Philip crying in that corner. The main doors burst open, and my mom rushed in, still wearing her work badge from the hospital. She grabbed me in a quick hug and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but she could tell I was scared. We walked together to the conference room where Detective McLean stood up and introduced herself with her full name, Rhoda McLean. She seemed nice, but really professional as she explained she needed to understand exactly what happened this morning. Mom said she wanted to be present for any questions, and the detective agreed right away. She asked me to start from the beginning when Mrs. Osborne first locked the door. I told her about the screaming and the accusation about the prank call. I explained how Mrs. Osborne said her mom died from a heart attack. The detective wrote everything down and asked me to slow down a few times. When I got to the part about Philip confessing to me, she stopped writing and looked up. She asked me to repeat exactly what Philip said, word for word if I could remember. I closed my eyes and tried to remember his exact words about the dare and the $20 and wanting to be cool. She had me write it all down on a piece of paper while it was fresh in my mind. Through the conference room window, I could see the hallway getting more and more crowded. Parents were everywhere now, some of them yelling at the office staff. A security guard was trying to keep people calm, but it wasn't working. Someone must have called for a soft lockdown because I heard the announcement over the speakers telling all students and staff to remain in their classrooms. The detective asked me more questions about Aiden and if I'd ever seen him bully Philip before. I told her I didn't really know them that well, but Aiden was always doing stupid stuff to get attention. She asked about Mrs. Osborne too, if she'd ever acted strange before today. I said no. She was actually one of the nicest teachers before this happened. The interview took about 40 minutes total. When we finished, the detective thanked me and said I'd been really helpful. She gave my mom her business card in case we remembered anything else. Mom and I went back to the main office to sign me out, but the secretary said we needed to wait because they were still processing everyone. We sat in the uncomfortable chairs and watched everything happening around us. That's when I saw Philip being walked down the hall by an older woman who must have been his grandmother. She had her arm around his shoulders, and he looked even smaller than usual. He glanced at me as they passed, and his eyes were red and puffy from crying. The terror on his face made my stomach hurt. They took him into another room with Detective McLean. About 10 minutes later, I watched Aiden walk past with his parents. His usual confidence was completely gone, and he stared at the floor as he walked. His dad looked mad enough to explode, and his mom was wiping her eyes with a tissue. They went into Gary's office and closed the door. We could hear raised voices but couldn't make out the words. The detective interviewed Aiden for over an hour, while the rest of us were finally allowed to leave. The hallway was packed with families trying to get their kids and leave. Everyone was talking at once, spreading rumors about what really happened. Some people said Mrs. Osborne had a gun, which wasn't true. Others said multiple kids were arrested. Parents were recording everything on their phones, and I knew this would be all over social media within hours. Mom drove me home in silence, and I stared out the window thinking about everything. That evening we turned on the local news, and there it was. The top story about a teacher who held students hostage after her mother's death. They didn't say any names, but showed footage of our school and interviewed some parents in the parking lot. Everyone at the school would know exactly who they meant. Mom heated up leftover pasta for dinner, but I couldn't eat anything. My stomach felt sick thinking about Philip and what might happen to him. He was just a kid who wanted friends and made a really stupid choice. Mom sat with me at the kitchen table, and we talked about how one stupid decision can destroy so many lives. She said Philip would have to live with this forever, knowing his prank call caused someone to die. She also said Mrs. Osborne would probably never teach again after locking us in like that. Even Aiden would face serious consequences for paying someone to commit what turned out to be a crime. None of them probably imagined it would end up like this when they made their choices. Mom held my hand and said she was proud of me for telling the truth and helping Philip when he needed someone, but I didn't feel proud at all. I just felt sad for everyone involved. The next morning, Mom drove me to the school even though I usually took the bus because she wanted to make sure everything was okay. The parking lot was way emptier than usual, and when I got to first period, only about half the kids were there. A substitute teacher sat at Mrs. Osborne's desk looking nervous, while Alina LeBlanc, the counselor from yesterday, stood by the door greeting everyone as we came in. She had this fake calm smile that didn't reach her eyes and kept asking if we were doing all right. The substitute introduced herself as Miss Rodriguez and said she'd be teaching us for a while but didn't explain how long. Alina took over and started talking about trauma and how it was normal to feel scared or confused after what happened yesterday. She passed around a feelings chart and asked us to point to how we were doing, but most kids just stared at their desks. Kenny picked angry, and Danica picked sad. But when it got to me, I just passed it along without choosing anything. Alina kept trying to get us to share our thoughts, but the room stayed mostly quiet, except for the sound of someone's pen clicking over and over. She gave up after 20 minutes and let Ms. Rodriguez start teaching, but nobody could focus on the lesson about symbolism in literature when we'd just lived through something that felt way too real. During lunch, I sat with my usual group and heard that Philip had been suspended while they investigated everything. Someone's older brother worked at the courthouse and said he saw Philip there with his grandma and a lawyer, which made my stomach drop, because that meant this was getting really serious. The cafeteria buzzed with rumors about what would happen to him and whether he'd go to jail for making the call that killed Mrs. Osborne's mom. Kids kept looking over at the empty spot where Philip usually sat alone with his sandwich and library book. 2 days later, Aiden showed up at the school again, but he looked different without his usual cocky walk and loud voice. He sat in the back of every class and didn't talk to anyone. Not even Alex, who used to be his best friend. I watched Alex tell a group of kids that he had nothing to do with the dare and didn't even know Aiden was going to do it. Their friendship was completely destroyed, and you could see Aiden knew everyone blamed him for what happened to Philip and Mrs. Osborne's mom. 3 days after that, Detective McLean came back to the school and set up in the conference room again. She called in more students throughout the day, especially anyone who might have seen Aiden and Philip together or heard about the dare before it happened. I saw Ian go in for almost an hour, and when he came out, he looked pale and kept rubbing his hands on his jeans. Later, I found out he'd told the detective about hearing Aiden bragging the day before the incident about getting Philip to do something hilarious for $20. Ian said Aiden had been laughing about how easy it was to get the quiet kid to do whatever he wanted if you just called him names and waved money around. This information spread through school within hours and made everything feel even worse because it showed Aiden had planned it all out. The school board called an emergency meeting that Friday night, and the auditorium was packed with angry parents demanding answers. Mom and I sat in the middle section and listened to parents yelling about how a teacher could lock kids in a room and whether their children were safe at the school. Some parents wanted to press charges against the school for allowing it to happen, while others defended Mrs. Osborne, saying grief made her snap. Gary Barnett stood at the podium trying to calm everyone down, but his voice kept getting drowned out by the shouting. He finally got everyone quiet enough to announce that Mrs. Osborne had been placed on administrative leave while the police investigated what she did to us. He also said the school was putting in new rules about how teachers could handle emergencies, and that all staff would get training on appropriate responses to crisis situations. Parents kept interrupting with questions about lawsuits and whether Mrs. Osborne would ever be allowed near their kids again. Gary looked exhausted as he tried to answer everything, while also protecting Mrs. Osborne's privacy and not saying anything that could affect the legal case. A week passed before we heard that the district attorney was officially charging Mrs. Osborne with false imprisonment and child endangerment for locking 30 students in a classroom for hours. The news hit everyone hard because even though what she did was wrong, we all remembered how nice she'd been before her mom died. Some kids said she deserved to go to jail for traumatizing us, while others felt bad that she'd lost her mom and now might lose her freedom too. The whole situation felt complicated with no clear good guys or bad guys, just a bunch of people who made terrible choices that spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, Philip's case went to juvenile court, where they charged him with harassment and making terroristic threats, even though he never meant for anyone to actually die. His age helped him because 15-year-olds don't usually get tried as adults, but the judge still took it seriously since someone died because of his prank call. I heard his lawyer argued that Philip was manipulated by an older student and only wanted to fit in, which was true, but didn't change what happened to Mrs. Osborne's mom. 2 weeks later, the court clerk called my name and I walked up to the witness stand with my legs feeling like jelly. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood panels everywhere and a big seal behind the judge's bench. Philip sat at a table with his lawyer, looking even smaller than he did at the school in his oversized suit that must have been borrowed. His grandmother sat behind him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue every few minutes. The prosecutor asked me to tell everyone exactly what Philip said to me that day in the classroom. I looked at Philip, who kept his head down, staring at his hands folded on the table. I told them about finding him crying behind the desks, and how he confessed about the dare and the $20 from Aiden. The judge wrote notes while I talked and asked me if Philip seemed sorry when he told me. I said he was shaking and crying, so hard he could barely get the words out. When they let me step down, I walked past Philip's table and saw tears running down his face again. The hearing lasted 3 more hours, with other kids from class getting called up to say what they saw and heard. Ian testified about Aiden bragging about getting Philip to do something for money the day before everything happened. The judge decided Philip would stay in the juvenile system instead of being tried as an adult, which made his grandmother cry with relief. Outside the courthouse, Mom waited for me, and we watched as news crews tried to interview people leaving the building. Aiden's hearing happened the next week, and his parents showed up in expensive suits with a lawyer who looked like he cost more than our car. The prosecutor charged him with criminal solicitation since he paid Philip to make the threatening call. His lawyer kept arguing that teenage boys dare each other to do stupid things all the time, and nobody expects someone to die from it. The judge didn't seem convinced and set another hearing date for 2 weeks out. Meanwhile, at the school, they brought in 3 trauma counselors who started meeting with our first period class twice a week. Alina LeBlanc ran the sessions in the library since nobody wanted to go back to Mrs. Osborne's old classroom. At first, everyone just sat there staring at the floor, but after a few sessions, Riley started talking about how scared she was during the lockdown. Then Danica admitted she still had nightmares about being trapped in that room. Even some of the tough guys like Alex finally opened up about feeling helpless when Mrs. Osborne wouldn't let us leave. The counselors taught us breathing exercises and gave us papers about dealing with trauma that most kids threw away as soon as they left. Ian told me during lunch one day that his mom saw something interesting at the courthouse. Philip's grandmother had been talking to someone from Mrs. Osborne's family outside after a hearing. He said they talked for almost an hour, and both women were crying by the end. Nobody knew what they said, but it seemed like Philip's grandmother was trying to apologize for what her grandson did. 2 weeks after that, Philip came back to the school with all kinds of conditions from the court. He had to check in with the office every morning and couldn't be anywhere near Aiden, who was still coming to the school while his case worked through the system. Philip also had to go to counseling twice a week and do 60 hours of community service at a senior center downtown. That first morning back, everyone stared at him walking through the hallways with his head down and his backpack pulled tight against his shoulders. Kids whispered and pointed while some moved away from him like he might be dangerous. At lunch, he sat alone at a table in the corner, picking at a sandwich without eating any of it. I heard people calling him a killer even though it wasn't really murder since he didn't mean for anyone to die. Some kids from other classes who didn't even know the whole story made up rumors that got worse every time they got repeated. The next day at lunch, I saw Philip sitting alone again looking miserable. I grabbed my tray and walked over to his table, even though Kenny tried to wave me back to where our usual group sat. Philip looked up surprised when I sat down and mumbled something about how I didn't have to sit with him. I told him I wanted to, and started eating my pizza while he went back to picking at his food. We didn't talk much that first day, but he seemed less tense with someone else at the table. The next day, Danica joined us, and then Marco came over too. Within a week, we had 5 or 6 people sitting at what everyone started calling the outcast table. None of us talked about what happened, but we all knew we were the ones who couldn't pretend everything was normal again. Aiden's final sentencing happened a month later, and the judge gave him probation and community service just like Philip. He also had to pay $5,000 in restitution, though nobody really understood who that money went to, since Mrs. Osborne's mom was dead. His parents pulled him out of our school the next day and enrolled him at St. Joseph's Academy across town, where nobody knew about what happened. I heard from Alex that Aiden tried to text him a few times, but Alex never wrote back because their friendship was completely over. 3 months after everything started, the prosecutor finally set Mrs. Osborne's trial date. They offered her a plea deal for probation and mandatory counseling since everyone understood she was grieving when she locked us in that classroom. Her lawyer argued that losing her mother broke something in her mind temporarily, and she never would have done it under normal circumstances. Some parents wrote letters to the judge saying she should go to jail for traumatizing their kids, while others wrote about how she was a good teacher before this happened. During all this, Alina LeBlanc started a support group that met every Thursday after school in the library. She called it a safe space to process our feelings about what happened without judgment. At first, only a few of us showed up, but eventually almost half the class started coming to meetings. We sat in a circle and took turns talking about how the incident changed us and how we felt about school now. Some kids said they couldn't focus in class anymore, and others admitted they got nervous whenever a teacher closed the classroom door. I told them about the nightmares where I was trapped in that room again, but this time nobody could get out. Alina taught us that trauma doesn't just go away, and we might be dealing with these feelings for a long time. Philip started his community service at Riverside Senior Center the next week, and I saw him getting dropped off there every Tuesday and Thursday after school. The judge had ordered 60 hours, and he had to sign in with the director each time he arrived. I went with him once because my mom thought it would be good for me to see him taking responsibility. The old people there didn't know anything about what he'd done, so they just saw a quiet kid helping serve lunch and playing checkers with them. One woman named Dorothy kept asking him to be her partner for bingo, and he'd sit there marking her cards when her hands shook too much. After a few weeks, he told our support group that listening to them talk about their families made him understand how Mrs. Osborne's mom must have felt getting that call. Meanwhile, the school sent out new forms saying all teacher contact would go through the main office phone system from now on. They took down the emergency contact sheets we'd all signed and replaced them with cards that only had the school's number. Parents had to register their phone numbers in a secure database that teachers couldn't access directly. Gary Barnett held an assembly explaining the new safety protocols, where classroom doors would have emergency override codes that administrators could use. 3 months crawled by before Mrs. Osborne's court date finally arrived. I went with my mom because she said we needed to see how everything ended. Mrs. Osborne walked into the courtroom looking like she'd lost 20 pounds, and her hair had gone gray at the roots. She stood in front of the judge and apologized to all of us for what she'd done that day. The prosecutor recommended probation with mandatory grief counseling and anger management classes. Her lawyer explained she'd already started therapy and was taking medication for depression. The judge accepted the plea deal and gave her 2 years probation plus 1,000 hours of community service. Right after the hearing, a group of parents started a petition to ban her from ever teaching again. They collected over 200 signatures in 3 days and presented it to the school board at their monthly meeting. Other parents wrote letters saying she deserved compassion because grief had made her do something she never would have done otherwise. The arguments got heated at the board meeting with people yelling about child safety versus second chances. The board went into closed session for 3 hours before announcing their decision. Mrs. Osborne could return to teaching after completing her sentence, but not at our school or any school in the district. She'd have to find work in another county if she wanted to teach again. Nobody seemed happy with the compromise, but at least it was over. During all this, Philip threw himself into his schoolwork like it was the only thing keeping him sane. His grades went from C's and D's to straight A's within 2 months. He started staying after school to help younger kids with their math homework in the library. The math teacher said he'd never seen such a dramatic improvement in a student before. I started having panic attacks whenever a teacher closed the classroom door. My hands would get sweaty, and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. Mom made an appointment with Alina, who started seeing me every week after school. She taught me to count my breaths and imagine myself somewhere safe when the panic started. We worked through what happened that day and my guilt about being the one who got Philip to confess. She reminded me that telling the truth was the right thing, even though it led to all this mess. 6 months after everything started, our class organized a memorial service for Mrs. Osborne's mother at the school auditorium. Most of us showed up even though nobody made us go. Philip sat in the very back row with tears running down his face the whole time. People got up and shared memories of Mrs. Osborne from before that day when she was our favorite teacher. Someone played a video montage of class trips and projects we'd done together. Mrs. Osborne's sister came to speak at the end. She talked about how her mother had been a teacher too and always believed in giving kids second chances. She said her mom wouldn't want her death to destroy more lives and that forgiveness was the only way forward. She looked right at Philip when she said that part, and he completely broke down, sobbing. After the service, Philip spent weeks writing a letter to Mrs. Osborne's family. He showed me 3 different drafts where he tried to explain what happened without making excuses. He wrote about the dare and the $20, but also took full responsibility for his choice. He mailed it to Mrs. Osborne's sister, but never got a response. He told me at lunch one day that writing it helped him start to forgive himself, even if they never forgave him. The letter was his way of facing what he'd done instead of hiding from it forever. The next few months were weird, because people kept showing up at our school to study what happened. Gary Barnett had to meet with administrators from other districts who wanted to learn about crisis management. They'd walk through our hallways with clipboards and serious faces while we tried to ignore them. I saw them taking pictures of our classroom door and the locks that got changed after that day. They interviewed some teachers, but most of us students just wanted to forget about it. Alina LeBlanc started something new in January called a peer mediation program. She trained us to help other kids work out their problems before things got bad. About half our first period class signed up, including me and Ian and even Danica. We met every Tuesday after school in the library to practice talking through conflicts. Alina taught us to listen without judging and ask questions that helped people figure things out themselves. The training helped me deal with my own stuff too. I was still having trouble with closed doors, but working with other kids made me feel less alone. Spring came, and I was at the grocery store with my mom when I saw Mrs. Osborne by the frozen food section. She looked different with her hair shorter and no makeup on. We made eye contact for a second, and she gave me this tiny nod before turning and walking away. That was it, but somehow it felt like she was saying she understood, or maybe that she was sorry. I never saw her again after that. Around the same time, Philip got news that changed everything for him. He'd applied to this early college program at the community college for his senior year. The acceptance letter came in April, and he actually smiled for the first time in months. The program would let him take college classes instead of regular high school ones. He'd get a fresh start where nobody knew about the phone call or what happened after. He told me at lunch that he was scared but also excited to be somewhere new. The rest of junior year went by fast with everyone focused on grades and college prep. Our class had gotten closer through everything that happened. Kids who used to hate each other would nod in the halls or share notes before tests. Even the popular kids and the quiet ones mixed more than before. We all knew what we'd been through together, and it made the usual high school drama seem stupid. Senior year started without Philip since he was at the community college program. I heard from Ian that he was doing great with straight A's and even making some friends. Nobody there knew his history, so he could just be a smart kid working hard. Graduation day came in June, and the whole gym was packed with families. Gary Barnett gave his principal speech about our class being special. He talked about resilience and strength without saying exactly why, but everyone in our class knew what he meant. Parents shifted in their seats because they knew too. When he finished, there was this moment where all of us from that first period looked at each other. It was like a silent agreement that we'd made it through something huge together. Then came the surprise nobody expected. Philip walked up to the podium as salutatorian even though he'd finished at the community college. He'd earned enough credits to graduate with us and wanted to speak. The gym got really quiet as he adjusted the microphone. His voice was steady when he started talking about second chances and how our choices matter. He didn't mention the call directly, but talked about learning from mistakes and how forgiveness can change everything. Some parents looked uncomfortable, but most people were listening hard. He talked about the people who helped him when he didn't deserve it and how that made him want to be better. When he finished, the whole auditorium stayed quiet for a second before people started clapping. After graduation, I had to decide what to study in college. Watching Alina work with all of us had shown me how much psychology could help people. She'd taken kids who were falling apart and helped us find ways to heal. I wanted to learn how to do that for other people. When I told her at the last peer mediation meeting, she smiled and said I'd make a great psychologist. She wrote me a recommendation letter that probably helped me get into my top choice school. The summer before college, a bunch of us decided to meet up one last time. We went to the park near school on a random Tuesday evening. Ian was there, and Danica and Kenny, and even some kids I'd never really talked to before that day in the classroom. We didn't plan it, but nobody mentioned what happened directly. Instead, we talked about college plans and summer jobs and normal stuff. But there was this understanding between us about how that day had changed who we were. People who'd been scared to speak up were now more confident. Kids who'd been mean had learned to be kinder. Before everyone left to go home, Philip pulled me aside near the swings. He looked healthier than he had all year with some color in his face. He thanked me for sitting with him that day when he confessed. He said knowing someone saw him as a person, and not just his worst choice, gave him hope. He told me that moment when I sat down next to him was when he realized maybe he could get through this. We shook hands, and then he surprised me by pulling me into a quick hug before walking away. 3 weeks into my freshman year at State, I got an email from Alina asking how college was going. She mentioned she'd heard from someone that Mrs. Osborne had started teaching again at Jefferson High 2 counties over. The person who told her said Mrs. Osborne looked thinner and older, but was back in the classroom doing what she loved. I thought about her standing in front of new students who had no idea what happened to her mom or what she'd done to us that day. My psychology professor assigned us to write about a personal experience that showed how people deal with crisis. I sat in my dorm room for hours trying to figure out how to put that whole mess into words. The cursor blinked on my laptop screen while my roommate played video games and ate chips. I started typing about the locked classroom and Philip's confession and how everyone turned on each other. The paper ended up being 12 pages long when the requirement was only 5. My professor wrote comments all over it saying this was exactly the kind of real-world example that showed how trauma creates unexpected connections between people. She asked if she could use it as an example for future classes with the names changed. I said yes because maybe it could help other people understand how quickly things can spiral. One night I was scrolling through Instagram and saw Aiden's face pop up in my feed. Someone from our old school had posted a picture of him at his new place wearing a college sweatshirt. The caption said he'd gotten into Tech University, which a pretty good school. I clicked through to his profile and saw pictures of him at orientation and moving into his dorm. He looked happy in a way I'd never seen him back when he was always trying to act tough. People really do move on from the worst things they've done. My phone buzzed with a Facebook message while I was studying for midterms. Philip's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach did this weird flip. He wrote that he wanted me to know he'd gotten accepted to the State University with a full scholarship for academics. He was planning to major in social work because he wanted to help kids who made bad decisions like he had. He said working at the senior center had shown him how much he liked helping people who needed it. The message was long, and he thanked me again for being there when everything fell apart. I wrote back congratulating him and telling him he'd make a great social worker. We ended up messaging back and forth for a while about college and classes and normal stuff. It felt weird, but also good to see him doing something positive with his life. During winter break, I ran into Ian at the grocery store, and we ended up talking in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes. He told me our whole first period class had a group chat going where people checked in sometimes. Someone would post about a hard test or a bad day, and others would respond with support. Even kids who never talked in high school were part of it now. Ian showed me his phone, and I scrolled through messages from Danica and Kenny and other names I recognized. They were planning to meet up over break at the coffee shop downtown. I showed up to the coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon and found half our old class sitting around pushed-together tables. Everyone looked older somehow, even though it had only been 6 months since graduation. We talked about college and jobs and regular things, but there was this understanding underneath it all. Riley mentioned she was seeing a therapist for anxiety, and nobody made it weird. Marco said he was pre-law now because of what happened with the false imprisonment thing. Everyone had been changed by that day in different ways. Spring semester, I signed up to volunteer at the campus crisis hotline after seeing a flyer in the student center. The training was intense with role-playing and learning about active listening and intervention techniques. The coordinator asked why I wanted to volunteer, and I told her about Philip without using names. She said personal experience often made the best counselors because we understood how important it was to really listen. My first shift was terrifying, but I kept thinking about sitting next to Philip on that classroom floor. Every call that came in reminded me that one person reaching out could change everything. Some callers just needed someone to hear them, while others were in real crisis. I learned to recognize the difference in their voices, just like I'd recognized something different in Philip's tears that day. The other volunteers were mostly psychology majors or social work students who had their own reasons for being there. We'd debrief after hard calls and support each other through the rough nights. One time, a kid called who sounded just like Philip had, scared and guilty about something he'd done. I stayed on the line for 2 hours helping him figure out next steps. After the call ended, I sat in the break room thinking about how different things might have been if Philip had called someone like this instead of Mrs. Osborne's mom that night. Everything that happened showed me that people aren't just good or bad, but complicated and messy. Even now, when I think about it all, I see how each person was just trying to survive in their own way. So yeah, that's basically the whole thing. Thanks for listening in. It always feels like a chat with a friend. Come back if you feel like hanging out again.